Michael Brendan Dougherty. Welcome to the Realignment.
Thank you so much for having me. It's awesome.
Good to see you, Michael.
I'm a big fan of what you guys do.
Thank you, man.
Thank you. And we're fans of yours, obviously. We are recording this episode specifically because you just went on Jane Coaston's podcast on The Argument. Jane's a friend of the pod. We've had her on twice. She, I think, is one of the better center-left to libertarian critics, interlocutors, analysts of the right. So that was fun to see on everyone's count. But let's just start with what you were talking about, which is this debate about the future of populism on the right. And I think for our purposes, because we have a real bipartisan audience, we could expand that to populism, not just of its right-wing variety, but also of its left variety and the ways that that intersects or doesn't intersect. But let's just start there. You had a really interesting piece referenced in the episode where you're discussing, is populism over with the ascension of Joe Biden? And you think that it's just getting started. Just articulate why you think the underlying features of populism are going to continue to move on in our politics.
So my thinking is based on the idea that what we are seeing is the kind of decomposition of a consensus, right? In the 1990s, and this was really dramatic, there was a trend kind of across the Western world after the Cold War of kind of traditional labor parties or parties of the left moving to the center, especially on economic issues. And they had tremendous political success with this at first. Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, movements in Italy and likewise. And that was a tremendous amount of electoral success. And it was viewed as almost like this post-Cold War orthodoxy, right? Freer trade, freer movement of people. In a weird way, it was almost like there were these, we're going to achieve socialist ends by capitalist means. Like we're going to dissolve borders and nationalities and these loyalties that get us into wars. And we're all going to get rich in the meantime. Well, not everyone got rich. And that consensus, just like all political consensuses do, it becomes corrupt. It doesn't work out as well for everyone as people thought. There's much larger costs to it than were thought of before. So the native working classes in these countries felt left behind, like they had no political representation. And, people began to formulate an objection. And what we saw, I think, in 2016 with Brexit and Donald Trump was this consensus finally receiving the electoral shock it was waiting for. And because that consensus was such a strong one among a policy cast and this was across the Western world and maybe even beyond it, I still think populism has a lot of running room left for challenging that consensus and challenging the people running it, challenging the class of people that captain it and profit from it. Because in a sense, Brexit and Donald Trump didn't leave as much change as you would have thought in 2016, right? The kind of patterns of global trade and investment are still basically what they were. And in fact, in a weird way, China's power is probably even more enhanced in 2021 than it was in 2016. And that China itself is going to be this huge factor, right? So one of the things driving that consensus was what we call globalization. And what I would say is globalization is like a euphemism for Sinicization, for the integration of China into the global economy. Because that's mostly what it's been, right? You already had the European market established going back decades. Globalization was China's integration into the world economy. And that has enriched people. It's created a kind of client class among our elites. And that's a problem for the American nation long term. And it's a problem I think that populist, nationalist movement can address. And it's only just starting to address.
So this is where I think it gets really interesting. And you know, I'll ask you the same question which Jane asked you, which is, what do you think populism is? What does right-wing populism look like and mean? We have a lot of left-wing critics of the show who will be like, this isn't populism. You don't support Medicare for all. And something we've tried to emphasize is that, look, populism is a tool. There can be neoliberal populism in many ways, like Bill Clinton, right? I mean, like there can be neoliberal populism. There can be centrist populism. There can be extreme right-wing populism, cultural populism. It's just a political tool to accomplish something. So define the terms of what you're looking at. You're saying that there's this crack within the institutions which have created an opening. What does that mean in your context, but also broadly?
So populism is a political style, and it emphasizes the authentic legitimacy of political power flowing from the people and not necessarily from an elite. Populism is a natural feature of democratic politics in the modern age, and it springs up in periods of elite failure, right? Like most of the time, our institutions in a country like America, where we have, you know, relative peace and prosperity, we put our faith in these institutions and they reward us with good governance or good enough governance. When governance goes bad, there's naturally like a kind of populist energy that rises up, and it's deep in the American tradition. It goes all the way back to the founding and then appears periodically throughout our history when our institutions demand reform and renewal. So that's what populism is. It can be captured by the left or the right. I mean, even a kind of populist energy can be captured by the elite. I mean, I was astounded in 2017, early on after this shock of Brexit and Trump. I mean, I saw Nick Clegg, who was the head of the Liberal Democrats in the UK. Mm-hmm.
He works for Facebook now.
He's since become like a front man for Facebook.
Yeah.
And he was like a populist of the elites. He was like, our opponents are illegitimate. They represent like a foreign intrusion into our politics. They are failing. They deserve to be shown to fail. So yeah, populism is that style. And our institutions, because of the kind of structure of American society, our Ivy Leagues are producing a class of people who are unfit to lead a great country. And that is, we are seeing that filter out into every institution, media institutions, Hollywood, governance, the ACLU, the New York Times, like all of these institutions are being deformed by this class of people. And so we need reform of those institutions. And until we get that, you're going to have populism, left and right. And there will be like, we have seen hints of left populism. There was the support for Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, Bernie Sanders here, Mélenchon in France. So this is an energy that's not owned by the right. And it's going to have different expressions left and right.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about how you've perceived, especially because he's president, Joe Biden's response to these populist trends? Because from my perspective, you're seeing modifications of that neoliberal, basically pre-2015 thing. So for example, I think there's a world where Bob Iger, leader of Disney, is ambassador to China, but that's no longer the world we live in, because that clearly is a bridge too far when it comes to China policy. You do see the Biden State Department upholding the Trump administration's decision to label what's happening in Western China against the Uyghurs a genocide. So you are seeing these modifications. And then, and most importantly, and this is relevant to our conversation today, you see the coronavirus package go through, where there's this very, very aggressive amount of money that's placed in the hands of everyday people in a way that wasn't replicated during the response to the 2008 financial crisis, which really drove a lot of the actual populism. So how would you rate the center left and then maybe the center right's response to the trends and the course corrections you're referring to in 1516?
They're both pretty bad, but the center, I think the right has been worse because there was just the shock of 2016 should have opened up the door to real reform and radical rethinking of our politics. And it slipped away from the Trump administration early on. I mean, they just couldn't staff an administration with the kind of creativity or foresight to meet the challenge of the moment. The center left is doing a little bit better, but not really. I mean, when you look at this, $1.9 trillion bill that's coming down the pike, I mean, there's a lot of fulfilling like a laundry list of pre-existing demands of kind of the Democrats' established interest groups and established, so, and that's good politics. And
the right could learn. Every time I hear somebody on the right bitching about this, I'm like, you had a chance, you just didn't do it to your own constituency.
Right. So, that is a problem. I still think, however, Biden has not been able to Biden is incapable of restraining the left generally, and he's incapable of restraining their power in the culture that irritates people, right? Like, I think that is going to be a major factor, that Biden probably has like decent political instincts about where the strengths of the Democratic Party are. It's just he doesn't have the institutional clout anymore to kind of take firm control of the Democratic Party. And he's getting some help in the Senate, sort of. Although I don't know why Manchin and Sinema are choosing the minimum wage as their kind of hill to fight their battle on.
Right.
So, he's made some adjustments, but again, there are a lot of decisions coming up really fast. Like, are we going to honor our deals in Afghanistan and leave, or are we going to stay? And what does that look like? Does the Taliban start shooting us again? Right. Because, where we get this bait and switch of, for the last year, Americans haven't had any casualties in Afghanistan, so it's totally fine to stay. It's no cost to us. But of course, that was predicated on a deal that we'll be breaking. Right. And once we break it, maybe casualties do pick up. And that'll be another reason to stay, because we have to avenge our honor. So, yeah, there is a fight here. I mean, the big question, I think, in American politics is, what party can credibly claim to be restoring the American dream for the middle class, right? The middle class is decomposing in this country. Some people are, it's true, filtering up into like a higher echelon, but a larger percentage are filtering down, becoming more precarious. And what you're finding is millennials are not able to form families like their Gen X counterparts or the baby boomers before them. They're not having as many children as they wanted to have. They're not buying a house. They're not attaining the level of wealth that previous generations had at their age. And it gets worse for the Zoomers below them. So that is, I mean, the American dream is dying, right? The American dream is, if I get an education, basically work hard and play by the rules at whatever it is I choose to do, I have a fair shot of attaining the living standards my parents had, or maybe even improving on them. And then passing that as an inheritance down to my children. Both as like a literal inheritance, like maybe it's your house or maybe it's your whatever happened to your 401k account, but more really the political inheritance of like, this is a decent country where decent people do well. And I don't think the Republicans have really wrapped their minds around that. I mean, you see little hints of it, and experiments like Mitt Romney's child allowance idea. I mean, this was not what I thought Mr. 47% of the country are takers was going to propose someday. But it fits with this populist trend in Europe where, populist right governments look at their national birth rate and look at the patterns of family formation and think like, okay, we need the state to not just subsidize old age, but also to subsidize this critical period of people's lives where they are financially strained, they're young in their earning life, and they don't have enough to get on the property ladder, and they don't have enough to feel confident having children.
Yeah.
Quick thing, Sagar.
Yeah.
Michael, especially because center left to left members of the audience here, can you contextualize the birth rate comment, just because every single time this turns into a whole thing? And I think this is a good faith opportunity to start, because once again, when I've talked about this with center left people, it's not something they literally ever hear. So you just contextualize the point of what we're, because we want to avoid, JD Vance, Washington Post op-eds before they're written and everything. So let's take the opportunity.
Okay. So, so I have this conviction that societies kind of don't work very well when they have this below replacement level birth rate. I think it creates a kind of panic about the future, and about how the future is being shaped, precisely because it's literally almost a confession that I am not shaping the future through raising my children, because I don't have children. If you're on the left, you might also look at like, okay, the entire social contract of the modern democratic world that was kind of rewritten at the beginning of the 20th century was predicated on this idea that there would be more children in the future than workers in the past, and that the children would be able to support those workers in their old age and give them a kind of dignified retirement, and avoid what was really, before the New Deal, a tremendous scandal of the poverty of old age. So now that may require, raising the birth rate, and also like if you're not into, if the welfare state argument doesn't work for you, look at the power argument or the economic argument, which is that the vast majority of economic growth is driven by population growth, right? And that creates not just, it's literally like investing into the future, right? Investing in posterity. You're giving resources to your children, and then your children do more with those resources than you could have imagined, right? Like you put them through public school until 12th grade, and then they go off into the world and start a business. They go off to college and start a corporation, right? So that drives up living standards. And what you can see is like in places like Japan, where the birth rate really has crashed and the overall population is sinking, you are seeing an erosion of living standards. You're also just seeing like a retreat of humanity before nature. And that also so we've moved from the welfare state to kind of an economic and power argument. And then I would finally take it to where I took it to in my own book, My Father Left Me Ireland, kind of a spiritual level, which is like, when we are having children and providing for children, there's almost something takes place, and it occurs to most people when they have their first child or when they have more than one child. For most people, if they had any kind of happiness in their own childhood, their children drive them back to their parents and to their grandparents, both as like resources, like help babysit my kids, but also suddenly finding wisdom in all the annoying things your parents and grandparents did. And so like children have a way of kind of spiritually, emotionally reconnecting us to our past, to our history, to our inheritance. And the fewer children we have, like if we're like as a civilization, we're heading towards children of men, all of that inheritance of our nation, of our civilization, maybe our religion, it begins to lose value even in the present to us, right? Because it's like, if it's just for me, maybe it isn't worth so much. But if it's something that's coming from my grandparents, my parents, to me, to my children, and to my grandchildren, and beyond, and each generation will renew this and kind of transform this tradition that they're handed on, then it has real value. And suddenly you are connected to your, not just your family, but your community and your nation your inheritance in this much larger sense, in a much more real way. And that helps us understand, and it helps motivate us to make the kind of sacrifices needed in the present to maintain a decent life and a decent nation for the future. So that's what I'm worried about, is that this is kind of like, in a way, we have as a civilization almost like withdrawn, and it's reflected in this birth rate. And it's almost like we're trying to resist investing in the future and kind of consume it all in the present. And that's actually deranging our politics too. I mean, one of the reasons the boomers have still such a stranglehold on our politics is just the lack of children.
There's
right?
a lot of them.
They should have been displaced so long ago from positions of power and influence. So also, if you're a progressive, maybe it would appeal to you in the sense of like, you could throw off the tyranny of the last generation if only there were children enough to do it. So anyway, so for all those reasons, I am one of these guys on the right that's kind of obsessed with this question of how do we get people to settle down and have more children? They say they want to have them, right? Like the when women are polled, they say they want to have more children than they are currently having, and at a number that would be above replacement level.
Right.
So that
and,
America would be
critically, just to interject, they also say the main reason they can't is because of money. Same with marriage. The number one reason people say they can't get married is because of money.
So let's get into this real quick, because this is really helpful, because I'm glad you brought up Japan earlier, because the Japan example is one that as people on the left start to engage more with the replacement rate conversation, is going to lead this conversation in a bunch of different ways. So when I've heard center left people talk about Japan, they'll say, Michael, you're totally right. Japan, you're seeing these very clear examples of how below replacement rate birth is actually really devastating for their country. However, Japan has a very simple solution in front of them. It's a wealthy country. They should let in more immigrants. They should be willing to literally let more people in, which would drive economic growth. And then, obviously there's the point that Japan is a unique country in many respects. It's tied that its civilization is much more tied to race and ethnicity than ours is. So what liberals also say is, well, Michael, we're even better suited to resolve this question than Japan is, because we can say, look, we have this birth rate issue. Let's let in more migrants who tend to have more children. Let's let in more people who are more who will reinvigorate this society. That's the purpose of having a melting pot. What is your response to that? Because I think this is the good faith center-left neoliberal response to the birth rate question.
So my response is twofold. One, yes, it is a huge advantage that America has this assimilative capacity and tradition, and immigrants do renew the American dream. I mean, when you poll people about the American dream, immigrants in much poorer circumstances than most Native Americans are often much more attached to it than we are.
True.
So that is absolutely true. However, my response would be, if your society is structured in a way that you are like a human shredder, right? You will find that you're basically inviting immigrants in, and then in one or two generations, right now it's almost one generation, they converge on the native birth rate here because of whatever the socioeconomic and social pressures are. I mean, that's how powerful American assimilation is in some ways, right? Is that within one or two generations? This is a very that's how powerful America's assimilative capacity is, right? Is that in one or two generations you converge on what most Americans are doing, which is not having very many children. So like you're literally just creating like a kind of population sinkhole in the world. And what I'm saying is if children are good for us natively, they're good for the people that joined us yesterday, and they're going to be good for the people that join us tomorrow. And further, right? I mean, he kind of makes this, Christopher Caldwell makes this point, which, is putting it very harshly, but in societies that are falling in population, native response to immigration becomes hostile, right? It becomes more hostile because it feels like we're being replaced, right? And I know that rhetoric is what freaks the left out. It should freak them out, right? Because
you don't want this. This is one of the things. It's like, you don't want to encourage this, right?
Right, exactly. You don't want to encourage this. And I'm not saying let's give in to this evil impulse. I'm just saying let's recognize this for what it is. People who are reproducing, right, when America had really high birth rates, it did tend to be more welcoming of immigrants. Not all the time. And when you actually see in the 1920s, when the Restriction Acts come, that is when there's this big fall off in native fertility too. So there is a response there. So my argument would be, my other argument to the left would be, let's not play the politics of austerity with the human race, right? Like, let's be more than zero sum thinkers. Let's be dynamists. Let's take some language from the libertarians and say that we can actually grow the pie that we share, which I think we have to, right? I think fundamentally we have to have a kind of optimism that the problems of a growing population can be solved with the new members of that society.
Yeah.
Right. So I know people have like in the back of their mind that like the earth is running out of resources, or I hate my crowded commute on the subway in the morning. And it's like, I think these are problems we can actually solve and have faith in, rather than kind of having this parsimonious view that like, well, fewer humans would make this all a bit easier. Like, true, like your commute sucks. I agree. But like,
I miss my commute, frankly. So
I know.
We could also build new trains. We could also replace New York City's train system. You're just throwing that out there.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. But that's also right. That's also this view of like, okay, if you have a society that encourages family formation and people are raised in larger families than 1.2 kids or whatever, they're just going to be formed in such a way that they have larger networks, larger access to resources, and more practice sacrificing for the common good, right? Like in their own home, in their neighborhood. And like one of the things that's like, I also think this is at the heart of some of the economic stagnation, and this is kind of advanced theory of the natalists, which is that for most of human history, most people's job networks, professional networks, dating networks were determined by their extended kin and the extended kin of their like neighbors and neighborhood.
Yes.
Like literally, you are raised in a large family. Like I grew up on a block. I was an only child. I grew up on a block with lots of families with like 4 or 5 or 6 kids. And yeah, in that brood of like 5 or 6 kids, you would have kids that don't fit in with their mom and dad very well. Like, I don't want to grow up to be what dad is or do what mom is, but I have a cousin or I have a neighbor whose uncle does X, Y, or Z. And suddenly I have access somehow to something that interests me, that like, when we're literally have like smaller networks, it's harder to find those resources naturally, right? Like family and cousins and aunts and uncles, like you're kind of forced to live with them. And that's a burden and a blessing as well. But like, it does kind of give you access to the world in a different way through more people's eyes. Like it's literally diversity. Like I'm literally talking about diversity at the micro scale. So yeah, I think all of that stuff is important. So that's my huge rant on natalism.
Honestly, that is genuinely the best articulation I've heard, that both any center left, center right, far right person could all actually coalesce behind. And honestly, I believe mostly in universal arguments whenever it comes to things like this, because you're never going to be able to singularly satisfy a single constituency. I do want to interrogate just one idea around because by the way, I agree with you. This is probably the single biggest crisis facing the capital W West, and particularly the United States. If the right is to be the vehicle that gets this done, there are a couple of things that need to be reconciled. And I think economic policy is probably first and foremost. And it's like you just saw. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, 1.9 trillion, much of it was like a pension bailout to blue states. They bailed out their constituents. Maybe Republicans are just dumb enough not to do it. Same with teachers unions and many other things. From that perspective, how do we reconcile that if what is to bring Biden down, the Democrats down, it will almost certainly be cultural in some form. And so I've been, kind of turning this around in my head, which is that we have to grapple with Trump won 10 million more votes in 2020, despite not governing as a populist. His only real legislative accomplishment was a massive corporate tax cut, and largely, data shows this, giveaway to the top income tax bracket. And yet, he won more union votes in places like Ohio. He won more Latino votes in South Texas and in South Florida. He won millions more. And I think largely it was all because of the culture war. And I think that's fine. I'm not angry with people for voting that way. But I'm saying, Michael, if there are going to be people like you and me, to some extent, pushing this type of policy, what justification can we give GOP politicians? Because the lesson I would learn is, oh shit, I'm going to dial this thing up to 20. I can win a ton of votes and cash my Chamber of Commerce checks at the exact same time. I can govern in the way that the chamber wants me to in Washington, and I can go and I can rail against the left and Dr. Seuss and Potato Head and trans bathrooms all day long, and I will win. I will not just win, I'll win big in Ohio, a state that Barack Obama won in 2008. How do we grapple with that political dynamic? Like, what incentive can I offer to any young politician to say, you should talk about family formation and policy and economics? You don't have to vote the way that you have been. So how do we think?
It is a tough challenge in America for a couple of reasons. So, one of the reasons that if you look over to the UK, right, which is a good example because 2016 was this big year.
Yep.
Okay, what happened to the Labour Party and the Tory Party? Well, one of the things that happened was the UK Independence Party by Nigel Farage. And that party was winning traditionally Labour voters, like traditional left-wing voters, workers in these depressed regions, right? And what people found out was that as the Tory party became identified with Brexit, right, which is like in a way, it was an issue with cultural baggage, even though it wasn't technically a cultural issue. Like, this isn't a sovereignty issue, but that still was a cultural issue. Those people who were traditional Labour voters, who like literally have memories of their parents like spitting on Thatcher's image, chasing her out, like chasing Tories out of their neighborhoods, like really loyal voters. Theresa May started breaking down and winning some of those voters, not enough to save her skin against Corbyn, but she started making inroads in those Labour heartlands. And then Johnson smashed through, partly because he was running against like a socialist, an out and out old line socialist. Mm-hmm. This is something that is imaginable for the GOP. And like, you could see the first glimmers of it in 2020, right? Where where the only people the GOP kind of lost as a category were basically upwardly mobile white men started moving into the Democratic column. But you had this unbelievable Trump turnout in rural areas that was unthinkable. And remember, some of those rural areas were places of prairie populism back in the day. Like, this isn't like, people think of rural voters now because they see these maps of red and blue and think, oh, those are just deep red, super conservative. Well, not always. So you're seeing a little bit of this transformation, but it's harder because we don't have this like transitional event like the UK Independence Party that kind of suggests to everyone that there's a group of voters that are voting for Democrats or voting for the left that can be brought over. And listen, it's harder to organize disorganized voters, right? Like these voters have lost their unions. They've lost these institutions that politically represented them. Many of them are disconnected from church, which may also mean that like a more populist, nationalist, right coalition, it has church members in it, but maybe it's not defined by that kind of evangelical personality that George W. Bush had, and that many of the moral majority leaders had. Maybe it's a little bit more diffuse. Maybe it's like something, it's like something where both like a church-going Jacobite Catholic like me and Joe Rogan can hang out. Like,
wow. Well, actually, this already is borne out in the data. I mean, a third of Trump 2016 voters are pro-choice. 1/3, disproportionately, actually, even more so in the upper Midwest.
Right, and and his biggest, like one of his strongest groups in the primaries was like what you would call unchurched evangelicals, right? So people who kind of come out of evangelical culture, but they are disconnected from their church somehow. So it's actually a complex picture. How will Republicans learn that this constituency is out there and that there's a kind of an entire politics to be built around it? They might only learn by getting their butt kicked a few times, right? Like it might be that
let me just
they don't do as well in 2022.
But what if they don't? So this is where I'm not sure if that the constituency holds, because let's say there's a Biden border crisis, which basically is on the make right now.
Yeah.
You could win. You could win Ohio. You can win. You might even be able to win the presidency. If he has a massive border crisis and they handle it terribly like they did under Obama as well, maybe one or two other things, a slight drop in GDP, 6 months before the election, you could win on that alone, right? So like, I guess that's my question, which is that even with their ass kicked, I mean, they got their ass semi-kicked this time around, losing all three. I'm not sure they've learned. And I don't mean to be contrarian. It's just like, I want to make sure that we can try and impart this correctly. Go ahead, Marshall.
When we just build on that, though, because I like how you said learned, because the key thing is when we just put on my Kevin McCarthy hat, which I didn't know I had in the collection, but it's just there. If I'm Kevin McCarthy, what I've learned is, look, there's a whole portion of that rural prairie populist base which straight up hates center left to left people.
Yeah.
They don't like their vision for the country. They don't like their control of the institutions. But because of the nature of this group, they don't actually care about or are driven by policy that much. What I've just found over the past 4 years is that if you are a person who is primarily driven by policy outcomes and policy prescriptions, you're probably a Democrat or you're a dissatisfied, unpartied person. But if you're Kevin McCarthy, your response is, look, I'm going to go read Green Eggs and Ham for YouTube, because that is signaling to the GOP base that I don't like these libs. I don't like cancel culture. I don't like censoriousness. I don't see why Kevin McCarthy would read, you know what I need to do? I need to be a little more open to moving the party operationally to the left on economics, because the key thing, and this is what Sagar was getting at, and I'm not expecting a perfect answer on this because this is actually the dilemma facing right populism, is if it turns out that you can both say we are the party of blue jeans and beer, and signal that by saying, unlike those people at Amazon who cancel books, unlike those people at Facebook who want to tell your grandma what she can or can't say, and unlike those Biden liberals who went to the Ivy League, we don't want to cancel Dr. Seuss. That's enough. Why do you have to be open to not cutting the corporate tax rate? Why do you have to have an actual replacement for Obamacare? Why, separate from wanting the country to be better, right? Because this is where I think where we can be cynical. If your primary impetus is getting reelected and holding on to power, why would you actually change?
Well, one thing, I mean, listen, I don't know if other people are Talmudic scholars of Tucker Carlson, but like the undercurrent, like one of the undercurrents, and listen, you could criticize Tucker. Tucker's a friend. You can criticize how his show works or just how cable news works. But there's like this distressing thread underneath a lot of his monologues and underneath his last book, Ship of Fools, which is that, yeah, sure, you can feed like kind of bread and circuses populism, but there's going to come a time when the United States faces a real challenge, right? A real crisis, real economic crisis, and that will be a real political crisis. Like there will come a time when reading Green Eggs and Ham into the congressional record is the sort of act that's like, that becomes famous, like Marie Antoinette's "Let Them Eat Cake." Like this is the thing you do before you're like disemboweled like Mussolini in the public square. Like this is the sign of like a truly decadent political culture. And listen, in some ways we are living in the end of history, right? Like there is a sense in which America is this preeminent superpower. We have a challenge in China, but it's not like a mortal threat right now.
Not yet.
It doesn't feel like a mortal threat right now. And so like our leadership class can be allow themselves to fail, because when they fail, they just end up at like a highly paid think tank or like on cable news or actually more often than not as consultants to big financial firms, right? Or starting their own financial advisement firms that's based purely on trading their connections and their access to inside information, right? So they don't have that challenge now. And that's why the United States can have like a failed war for 20 years without anyone getting in trouble for it, right? Like Italy, a smaller country in World War II, has a failed war and they literally like disembowel the leader on the streets, right? Like small countries, when they make foreign policy mistakes, weak countries, there's like a real diminution of standard of living, and the leadership class like gets executed, like hopefully swiftly if they're lucky. So like in a way, we are victims of our own success, and the Republican Party is a victim of its own success, and it's infantilized because it finds it easy to win. And part of that is it's like is its geographic advantage, because in a 50-50 country,
quiet part out loud. Yeah.
The ties are going to go to the Republican Party just because of its geographic distribution. Now, I'm not for necessarily like rewriting our electoral system, but I'm just saying, I'm just recognizing that that's one of the reasons the Republican Party sucks so much. Is that like we are, and it's one of the reasons the Democratic Party sucks so much and disappoints Democrats so often, right? Like, is this kind of sense that our politics is low stakes because we've inherited so much advantage, right? Like this is literally the problem of privileged youth, right? Like, I mean, like we're literally talking about parties that are run by like dynasties in some cases, right? Like the Clintons, the Bushes, and so on. So anyway, that's just a long way of saying it's going to be really hard to move the Republican Party. But you are seeing hints of it, right? Like you're seeing just little hints. So like in my district, I'm in Westchester, New York, because I got to be near National Review. It's a wealthy area. And the Democrat who's running almost as a squad member is also running as a tax cutter, right? Like he ran and won his primary by promising to lift the SALT deductions over and over and over and over and over again, right? Like all the press was a proud, gay, Black Harvard man is running for Congress. And all the policy was, I'm going to lower your taxes and I'm going to preserve 529 deductibility and all of that stuff. So that's already happening on the Democratic side. So, and then you're seeing these hints like Romney's plan for families, even like the Rubio Lee stuff. I know tax credits are not like exciting.
Quick thing, Michael,
hardcore,
because we do have to. I do have to hit this point though. How many Republicans are actually picking up or are interested in Mitt Romney's project? I think Mitt Romney is this weird case because that's just because I think what makes this debate so difficult is that we are going to continually see these shoots of excitement and shoots of, man, there's this politician who's showing this path.
Minimum wage,
but there's just but I don't think it means, this is me, once again, like I appreciate how you're bringing the more optimistic tone in here. So this isn't just me trying to like dunk on that, but I just don't see a world where separate from his political scandals, where the Madison Cawthorns of the world say, man, the path to power in the GOP, it's really going to be by embracing a left, not in the sense that it's still center right, but it's moving to the left in economics. You say, you know what, man, Candace Owens is crushing it on Tucker tonight. Man, Turning Point USA, you go to that conference, and that is just incredible. The difference, because this is the inverse of your point about the 529 tax plans and the SALT tax. The Democratic Party is rewarding people for their policy choices. The Republican Party doesn't do that.
Well, listen, this is the problem of decadence, right? Like this is the problem of having a successful society. So what you need for dramatic change then is a man or a woman of real ambition, right? Like someone who's like, I don't want to just be in office. I want to be in the history books. I want to transform something about this country or preserve something about it. That is where you get these ideologically promiscuous figures like Teddy Roosevelt, like Winston Churchill, like Emmanuel Macron might be one of these people. I think he's going to fail, but he is showing you that he has like ambition. And he's like this, what are his politics? They're like this insane crossover of like, I'm a European federalist and I'm going to strengthen the European Union. I'm also a French nationalist and I'm going to be a hard ass on immigration and assimilation. And I'm a security state freak. I'm going to tell Marine Le Pen that she's soft on Islam and get to her right on that. Like it's because he has ambition, right? That he's driving himself to be creative, to not be satisfied. And what we have in our two-party system is like timidity, right? Which is like, let me check how the tweet is doing on Twitter.
Yep.
And one of the reasons people responded to Donald Trump was he seemed to be free of that timidity of our ruling class. And that's bred into our ruling class, right? That can be a good thing when you have a successful society, right? Is like, let's not change too much. But when you have, and we do have a successful society in many ways, but we do have these persistent problems. We have regions that are falling apart in this country. I mean, listen, in New York State alone, right? Like I'm in Westchester County and it looks like America's going great, right? Even now, even during COVID times, like people are driving nice cars, people live in nice houses, the streets are nice. You cross the bridge into Orange County, right? Which was like an Obama-Trump county. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like going to a completely different standard of living and a standard of expectation for what America can be for you. So that does have to be addressed, but you need ambitious men and women to address themselves to it. And we are in desperate need of them, right? Like, I mean, it's hard enough to get like a politician who's self-possessed, right? Like who has any like internal confidence in their own judgment, right? Because they're trained on look to the polls, look at the reaction on Twitter, look at listen to the last donor who called, listen to the think tank experts. And I'm speaking as a think tanker, right? Like there's a way in which politicians are scared to lead. So yeah, like, and Donald Trump, I don't think had good leadership qualities. What he had was cussedness and frankly, a cultural formation outside of this timid, decadent elite, right? Like it had a very different decadent elite formation with Roy Cohn and Howard Stern and the like, but in any way, we need someone of like real ambition who's like, I want to be a TR, and who has the stomach to do it. So for instance, Boris Johnson, I think may fail. He has the desire to be Winston Churchill, but he
wrote a book on him. Yeah, literally.
He doesn't seem to have the discipline for governance, which is difficult. He likes campaigning though.
Yeah. I mean, that was actually probably the best articulation I've heard as to how this will actually come about. And just an acknowledgement of, I love that it is a byproduct of our own success, that, this is what motivates people and actually leads to downward decline. And perhaps in the future, we're not sure yet what precipitating event that it could clear house. Michael, we really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you.
Where do you have a preference where people buy your book and check out more of your work?
Well, listen, I mean, buy my book at a bookstore, or like loot it from one. Like just interact with real people in real life. Yeah. If you must, go to Amazon and buy My Father Left Me Ireland. It is about, nationalism. It is about this moment, and it is about trying to break out of this cultural formation that is formless, voidless, and meaningless. I hope readers like it.
I think a lot of people could get a lot out of it. Thank you for joining us, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, always, man.